the battlefield in terms of U.S.China competition is going to be Southeast Asia. Please don't pressure us to take sides. It was a huge disappointment when the United States did not rectify the TPP. The United States need to present a more robust economic choice for the region so the region doesn't over-rely on one country, which is China.
In what ways is China's influence in Southeast Asia most apparent?
Well, to answer your first question about Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, I think probably trade is the most visible sign of Chinese influence. China is ASEAN's largest trading partner, and then since 2020, ASEAN replaced the EU as China's largest trading partner. And that relationship has deepened and is continuing to deepen. Digital trade is a big part of this story. Alibaba has a huge presence in this region. So you can imagine that the impetus provided by COVID actually drove this digital trade to deal with this global supply chain disruptions. So that's one sign of Chinese influence in this region. And the other one is, of course, the BRI. There are many projects of the BRI in Southeast Asia. And this is natural because we are the closest region to China. And there are some cultural similarities which make it easier for Chinese companies, relatively easier to function in this part of the world. Now, the other sign of Chinese influence in this part of the world is when you see countries increasingly taking into account Chinese preferences and interests when they make certain decisions. I mean, we have heard of some meetings, ASEAN meetings, where even if China is not present, countries will think, oh, maybe we shouldn't say this, maybe we shouldn't do that because the Chinese are not going to like it. So, I mean, I consider these are the three key signs that Chinese influence in this part of the world.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are there one or two BRI projects that come to mind when you think of either the most significant, the biggest, the most ambitious, the most influential?
In this region?
In the region.
Can I bring my book down?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a bit of self-advertisement. This book it's called Rivers of Iron, and I've written this with two other professors, one from the United States, the other from Malaysia. So this is actually, I would consider this the biggest, most visible infrastructure project in the region. It's not built completely yet. It's in the process of being built. It is a vision of a pan-Asia high-speed railway. The idea is to connect Southeast Asia to mainland, to China, the southern part of China, that's Yunnan. So the idea is to build this high-speed railway from Yunnan all the way down through Laos, to Thailand, through Malaysia, and then to connect Singapore outwards to the sea. Now, this vision, these are being built bilaterally with countries that I've just mentioned. The part with Laos has already been built, completed, and the ridership is very high. It was all constructed in time despite COVID. The portions that in Thailand are still work in process. As we know, the KL-Singapore portion has been put on hold because KL and Singapore are not able to come to agreement on how to move the project forward. So this is actually probably the most visible and largest project that you can think of in terms of high-speed rail, in terms of BRI projects. There are, of course, others that deal with, for example, building roads, highways, also special economic zones. Those are prominent parts. But when you finally put them all together, this is the one that's going to appear very high in Chinese profile in the region.
What makes China an attractive partner for Southeast Asian countries?
I can think of two key reasons why, and there could be more, why China is an attractive partner for Southeast Asian countries. One is that there is actually alignment of interest in terms of economic growth. China has been growing very well, and its growth has actually brought benefits to the region. So the region tends to think and view China's rise in a positive sense because its growth did bring about economic benefits for the region. So there's this alignment of interest. And the other thing about infrastructure building, and we were talking about the BRI, just talk about the BRI, is that the region desperately needs infrastructure. Multilateral organizations like ADB, the World Bank, can only provide a certain amount of these infrastructure funding, but the Chinese comes along and is willing to provide loans and to invest in risky projects that other countries that are reluctant to take on. Now, the other thing that makes Chinese partnership attractive is that Chinese do not there are no strings attached to these projects. There is no, you must have a certain level of liberalization, you must have a certain type of government, or adopt a certain value system in order to acquire Chinese finding and technology. China does not impose such conditions, and that is attractive for many countries in this region.
How are Southeast Asian countries responding to U.S.-China rivalry?
Two ways. Again, one is to ask and appeal to both superpowers to please keep your conflict treated as competition, and it may not necessarily be conflict. So Southeast Asians would prefer that there's healthy competition between the United States and China, while keeping, the tone on conflict, the intensification of the rivalry under control, because it is not beneficial for the region as a whole, for stability for the region and economic growth in the long term, if there is real conflict breaking out. And the possibility of armed conflict over an issue like Taiwan could be something that could even be devastating, not only for the region, but for the United States and China. Now, the other position the Southeast Asian countries have taken is that please don't pressure us to take sides. We don't want to make choices. Both the United States and China have been good for the region in different ways. The United States in being a security provider, and also the United States is actually the largest foreign investor in this world, in this part of the world, and China is the region's largest trading partner. So it's really difficult to choose, and the region really doesn't want to choose. I think that's a key message that has also been sent over to the United States and China.
Yeah. Are there any incidents or anecdotes in your mind that pop up of countries kind of being pressured to choose one side or the other within the region? And of course, understanding that every country has its own interests and its own independent foreign policy as well.
Okay,
anything that comes to mind?
Oh, okay. So I think the evidence is much more anecdotal than I think it's being carefully documented. Examples would be, whether messages from the Americans telling Singapore, and I heard this kind of messages myself. Eventually you got to think for yourself whether it benefits the region to side with the United States or to China. Do you really want an authoritarian system? Authoritarian country? Do you want to be under the influence of authoritarian country? These are the kind of messages the Americans will say, and that they will want, they will tell the region, you have to step up in the South China Sea, you have to take control of your own security instead of relying on the Americans. You've got to push back on the Chinese a bit more. And then that's the pressure from the American side. Now, from the Chinese side, they're a lot more, they're less direct. I think that's somewhat cultural, I believe. They're less direct, but the pressures are indirect forms. I think Singapore went through a period of that in 2016, 2017, when, for instance, the Hong Kong authorities actually impounded our T-Rex vehicles. They were training in Taiwan and coming back through Hong Kong to Singapore. And the Hong Kong authorities held on to it for 2 months. They didn't say anything, and Chinese authorities didn't say anything. But this is, in a way, an indirect pressure on us to cut our training in Taiwan. So that's just one example of indirect ways. And, the Americans tend to be a bit more direct in their approach to us.
Why should Americans be paying attention to Southeast Asia-China relations?
Well, first of all, Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing economic areas in the whole world, economic region. It is vibrant. There is an economic transition in terms of growth to this part of the world. It's one of the fastest growing regions. So it does benefit benefit Americans to pay more attention to Southeast Asia. That's one reason. The other reason is that the battlefield in terms of U.S.-China competition is going to be Southeast Asia, primarily because this is the area that's closest to China. It is, its traditional backyard, historical backyard, right, where the Chinese have most influence, whether it's cultural, whether it's economic. But the interesting thing is that even though America is not a resident power, But it is an Asia-Pacific power or Indo-Pacific power, as the region has been renamed, as having an identity as an Indo-Pacific power because its interests do translate to this part of the world. We have two American allies among Southeast Asian countries, Thailand and the Philippines, and other American allies nearby, South Korea and Japan. And Hawaii is not far away. And Taiwan is definitely also part of the region, very close by. America does have strategic interests in this part of the world, so it's both economic and strategic reasons, imperatives for Americans to pay attention to Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia's relations with China.
How can the United States be a better partner for Southeast Asian countries?
That's a great question, and that is, I think, something that the region has been sending messages to the United States about. I think there are three key messages that we have sent to the United States. First, you have to move beyond security because it is the interest of this part of the world, countries in this region, to think about economic growth. And I think that the United States need to move beyond security, think about economic benefits to the region, right? So it was a huge disappointment when the United States did not rectify the TPP. He has now put up the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the IPF, but it is not IPF does not give market access to countries, which is one of the greatest advantages of TPP. So I think the United States need to present a more robust economic choice for the region, so the region doesn't over-rely on one country, which is China. So that's one thing. Economics, be more of an economic provider and moving beyond security. The second one is perhaps not to pressure countries in the region to choose sides because, countries will make decisions based on their national interests. Too much pressure from either superpower, from the United States or China, is going to create a backlash. So it would actually behoove the United States to just not make calls for choosing sides because countries will not choose sides as far as they can, and then the lesser possibility of a backlash. The third, I think, message that has been consistently sent to Americans is that you have to be present to be a reliable partner. As I mentioned just now, in East Asia, the United States have 4 security partners. Now, obviously, there has been questions about reliability of the U.S. as an ally, especially for countries like Thailand, a long-term ally, but whose domestic politics is not something that America likes to see. And we know what happened when the military took over in 2014. There were sanctions imposed on Thailand, which is an ally. Now, understandably, from American value viewpoints, that this is something that they prefer not to see. But I think there's a need to recognize that there are certain expectations when you're ally of a state. You will expect that the country that you're allied with would actually help to ensure your regime stability, your regime legitimacy. So I think the U.S. will have to emphasize less on human rights, be more reliable as a partner, a security partner, even for a country like Japan. Obviously, when Trump came in, there were all these questions about making allies pay. Biden does not do that. The Biden administration has tried to build up these alliances, knowing how important these alliances are for U.S. global power. And I think that's something that the United States need to continue doing, to be present, to be a reliable partner, attend regional meetings. So these 3 messages that the region has been sending to the United States. First, to move beyond security, think about how economically you can bring benefits to the region, how to be an alternative, to provide an alternative choice to China as an economic partner. The second is to not pressure countries to choose side because that will create a backlash. Number 3, to be present and to be a reliable partner.